Violence is where Jean-Paul Sartre's philosophy loses all comfort. Up to this point, freedom, responsibility, conflict, and bad faith may still appear as abstract problems of selfhood and social life. Violence destroys that abstraction. It forces philosophy to confront bodies, suffering, and irreversible acts. Sartre does not treat violence as an anomaly. He treats it as a possibility that emerges from the same structures that govern ordinary human relations. The clash of freedoms, the pressure of constraint, and the collapse of justification all converge here. This is why Sartre refuses to dismiss violence as mere irrationality. Violence appears when conflict can no longer be managed symbolically. Language fails, recognition breaks down, institutions harden, possibilities narrow. Under these conditions, action is forced into extremes. Sartre insists that violence does not arrive from outside human freedom. It is produced by it, under pressure. This claim immediately raises suspicion. It sounds like an excuse. Sartre is aware of this danger. He does not say violence is justified simply because it arises intelligibly. Intelligibility does not equal innocence. Sartre's central claim is more disturbing. Violence may be unavoidable in certain situations, but it is never purified by that fact. To understand this, one must first understand what Sartre rejects. He rejects moral absolutism, the idea that violence can always be condemned from a position outside history. Moral absolutism treats violence as a violation of timeless principles. Sartre believes this position is dishonest because it ignores the situations that produce violence and the constraints under which people act. But Sartre also rejects moral innocence, the idea that violence is justified by necessity alone. Appeals to history, oppression, or inevitability function as alibis. They explain why violence occurs. They do not absolve it. Sartre insists that violence always remains an action, and therefore always remains a choice, even when options are catastrophic. This does not mean Sartre equates all violence morally. He is not flattening differences. He is insisting on responsibility. Responsibility does not disappear because the situation is tragic. This insistence forces a distinction between explanation and justification. Explanation answers the question, why did this happen? Justification answers the question, was this acceptable? Sartre allows explanation freely. He insists on justification relentlessly. Violence for Sartre is often explained by reference to constraint, oppression, desperation, historical pressure, or systemic injustice. These explanations may be accurate. Sartre does not deny them. But he insists that explanation cannot do the work of justification. To say there was no alternative is to describe pressure, not to eliminate responsibility. Sartre insists that alternatives do not need to be good to be alternatives. When every option is disastrous, choice becomes tragic, not mechanical. This is where Sartre's philosophy becomes hardest to accept. He refuses to let violence be cleansed by necessity. Even when violence is intelligible, even when it is provoked, even when it appears unavoidable, it remains a human act with human meaning. This is why Sartre insists that violence always carries guilt. Guilt here is not moral self-hatred. It is acknowledgement. To act violently is to accept that one has crossed a line that cannot be erased by explanation. One may believe the action was necessary. One may believe it was the least evil option, but one cannot pretend it was innocent. This refusal of innocence separates Sartre from both pacifist absolutism and revolutionary romanticism. Pacifism often condemns violence without acknowledging the situations that force it. Romanticism celebrates violence as purifying or redemptive. Sartre rejects both. Violence is neither simply evil nor secretly good. It is tragic. Tragedy for Sartre does not absolve responsibility, it intensifies it. Violence also exposes the limits of justification itself. Justification seeks reasons that can be shared, defended, and recognized. Violence often occurs where shared justification has collapsed. The world becomes divided into incompatible perspectives. Each side sees necessity where the other sees brutality. Sartre insists that this collapse does not eliminate responsibility, it multiplies it. One must act knowing that justification will fail, that one will be judged, and that one may never be vindicated. This is why Sartre believes violence should never be approached lightly, even when it appears historically necessary. To act violently while believing oneself morally pure is, for Sartre, the worst form of bad faith. Violence must be owned as violence. At this stage, Sartre is not offering an ethical rule about when violence is permissible. He refuses to provide criteria that could be applied mechanically. Any such criteria would become another alibi. Instead, Sartre insists on lucidity. One must see violence for what it is, an act that destroys, an act that cannot be undone, and an act that commits the agent beyond intention. This lucidity does not paralyze action. Sartre does not demand passivity. He demands seriousness. By the end of this first part, the basic position should be clear. Violence emerges from human freedom under extreme pressure. It may be intelligible. It may even be unavoidable, but it is never clean, never innocent, and never beyond judgment. The problem, then, is not whether violence can be justified in the abstract. The problem is how one lives with the meaning of violent action once justification fails. That problem cannot be resolved philosophically in advance. It must be confronted where violence actually occurs, in history, politics, and collective struggle. If violence cannot be purified by necessity, then Sartre forces us to confront what most moral philosophies try to avoid. What remains after violence has occurred? His answer is uncompromising. What remains is not closure, redemption, or moral clarity. What remains is responsibility that does not end. Violence does not solve the ethical problem it responds to. It displaces it, intensifies it, and transforms it into something that must be lived with rather than resolved. This is why Sartre refuses to treat violence as a means that can be redeemed by its ends. Ends explain why violence is undertaken, but they cannot erase what violence does. A life destroyed cannot be restored by future success. A body broken cannot be repaired by historical vindication. Sartre insists that consequences do not cleanse acts. This insistence places Sartre in direct opposition to philosophies that allow history to function as moral judge. He rejects the idea that success retroactively justifies violence. The fact that a violent action leads to liberation, stability, or victory does not convert it into a good act. It remains what it was, an act that destroyed freedom in order to pursue it. Sartre's rejection of historical absolution is central here. History, he argues, does not judge morally. It records outcomes, not meanings. To say, history proved us right, is to confuse survival with justification. History selects winners, not innocents. This confusion is dangerous because it transforms action into destiny. Once violence is presented as historically necessary, the moment of choice disappears. Responsibility is transferred from the agent to the flow of events. Sartre insists that this transfer is always dishonest. Even when violence appears unavoidable, it occurs in a moment where someone decides that other possibilities will not be taken. Those possibilities may be weak, symbolic, or doomed, but they exist. Violence is chosen instead of them. To deny this is to deny agency. This denial often takes the form of moral purification. People claim that violence was forced upon them, that they had no alternative, or that responsibility belongs entirely to the oppressor. Sartre rejects this purification without denying oppression. Oppression explains violence. It does not make it innocent. This is why Sartre insists that violence always carries guilt. Guilt here must be understood carefully. Sartre does not mean moral self-hatred or perpetual remorse. He means acknowledgement of transgression. Violence crosses a line that cannot be uncrossed. To act violently is to accept that one has done something that cannot be made clean by explanation. This acceptance is what separates seriousness from fanaticism. Fanaticism for Sartre begins when violence is treated as pure. When it is described as cleansing, redemptive, or morally elevating, responsibility collapses. The agent no longer sees themselves as accountable. They see themselves as an instrument of necessity, history, or justice. Sartre treats this collapse as catastrophic. Violence becomes most dangerous not when it is feared, but when it is celebrated. Celebration replaces judgment with certainty. Certainty eliminates doubt. Doubt is the last barrier against unlimited destruction. This is why Sartre insists that justification is never final. One may justify an act to oneself in the moment. One may believe it was necessary, but that justification remains exposed to revision, critique, and rejection by others and by oneself over time. To close justification is to deny responsibility. Sartre believes that those who engage in violence must live with this openness. They must accept that their actions will be judged, contested, and perhaps condemned. They must refuse the comfort of moral immunity. This demand becomes even heavier in collective violence. Revolutions, wars, and political struggles disperse responsibility across groups, institutions, and chains of command. Sartre insists that this dispersion does not eliminate responsibility, it multiplies it. Each participant must answer not only for what they did, but for sustaining the collective project that made violence possible. This does not mean responsibility is equal. Power matters, authority matters, decision-making capacity matters, but no one is exempt. Sartre's refusal of collective innocence is one of his most unsettling positions. One cannot hide behind slogans, movements, or historical necessity. To say we did this is already to accept participation. To deny personal responsibility within collective action is another form of bad faith. At the same time, Sartre does not collapse into moral abstraction. He recognizes that structural violence shapes the field of choice. Those who live under constant coercion face situations where non-violence becomes complicity. Sartre does not deny this. He insists only that it does not erase the meaning of violent action. Violence may be intelligible, it may be provoked, it may even be necessary, but it is never good. This refusal to moralize violence does not lead Sartre to pacifism. It leads him to tragedy. Tragedy is not error. It is action taken without moral escape. It is responsibility carried without innocence. Sartre believes modern politics desperately wants to escape tragedy. It wants clean hands, righteous narratives, and guaranteed virtue. Violence becomes tolerable only when it is disguised as inevitability or justice. Sartre strips away that disguise. To act violently, in Sartre's view, is to accept that one has entered a domain where no moral shelter exists. One must act and then live with what one has done, without pretending that history, necessity, or righteousness has absolved it. This is not paralysis. Sartre does not command inaction. He commands lucidity. Lucidity means seeing violence as violence, seeing responsibility as inescapable, seeing justification as provisional. It means refusing both moral absolutism and moral innocence. By the end of this analysis, Sartre's position should be unmistakable. Violence is not outside morality. It is where morality breaks under pressure. And when it breaks, responsibility does not disappear. It becomes unbearable and unavoidable. This is why Sartre believes that anyone who speaks lightly of violence has already fled responsibility. To speak seriously of violence is to acknowledge that it leaves wounds that no theory can heal. Violence confronts freedom with its darkest possibility, the power to destroy freedom in the name of freedom itself. And once that power is exercised, there is no return to innocence. Only responsibility remains.